In the year 117 AD, the Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent under Emperor Trajan. The empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, governing perhaps 65 million people. Yet that same year, Trajan died while suppressing a revolt in the east. Within a generation, Rome would abandon several provinces it could no longer effectively govern. The map had grown faster than the machine that ran it. This was not an accident. It was a pattern. Conventional understanding suggests that strong, stable states expand their territories. Stability first, then growth. But the historical record reveals something different. Across centuries, empires frequently expanded before their institutions matured. Conquest came quickly. Administrative capacity lagged behind. Roads, tax systems, legal integration, and communication networks developed slowly, often decades or centuries after territorial acquisition. This gap between expansion and institutional depth was not a failure of planning. It was structural. Expansion offered immediate rewards, plunder, prestige, elite loyalty, and revenue. Institutional development required long-term investment with delayed returns. The incentives favored growth over consolidation. What structural forces drove empires to expand outward before they had solved the challenges of governing inward? To understand why empires expanded before achieving internal stability, it helps to consider the mental and institutional landscape of pre-modern states. Rulers operated in environments where territorial conquest offered tangible, immediate benefits, while institution building remained abstract and costly. For ancient and early modern rulers, expansion served several strategic purposes. Militarily, it neutralized threats and created buffer zones. Economically, it provided plunder, tribute, and new tax bases. Politically, it generated prestige, legitimized rule, and rewarded military elites with land, offices, and wealth. Socially, it unified diverse internal factions around a common external project. Conquest was visible, measurable, and celebrated. Administrative reform was not. The incentives were clear. A successful campaign could enrich a ruler within months. Building a functioning provincial tax system might take decades. Conquering new territory could silence internal rivals by distributing rewards. Reforming bureaucratic structures risked alienating entrenched interests. Expansion deferred the harder work of governance. Moreover, early empires lacked the tools to quickly integrate conquered populations. Communication was slow. Messages took weeks or months to travel across large distances. Standardized legal codes, census systems, and administrative training programs required sustained investment. Local customs, languages, and power structures varied widely. Integration was a generational process. As a result, empires often relied on improvised solutions. Conquered elites were co-opted rather than replaced. Existing local systems were left partially intact. Military governors acted with broad discretion. Tax collection was contracted to private intermediaries. These arrangements allowed empires to extract resources and maintain nominal control without building full administrative infrastructure. This created a paradox. Expansion was fast because it required relatively little institutional capacity. Conquest needed armies, logistics, and short-term political will. But sustaining rule over new territories demanded legal systems, bureaucratic networks, infrastructure, and cultural integration, capabilities that developed gradually and unevenly. The result was a recurring pattern, rapid territorial growth followed by decades of institutional lag. Empires grew large before they grew stable. The map outpaced the machine. This dynamic was not unique to one region or period. It appeared in the Roman conquest of the Mediterranean, the Spanish seizure of the Americas, the Ottoman expansion into Arab lands, the Russian push into Siberia, and the European scramble for Africa. The details varied, but the underlying incentive structure remained consistent. Expansion offered short-term gains, while institution building imposed long-term costs. In each case, empires reached for territory before they had perfected the tools to govern it. Understanding this pattern requires examining specific historical cases, how conquest unfolded, how governance lagged, and what consequences followed. The Roman Empire, expansion outpacing administration, 264 BC, 284 AD. Rome's territorial expansion was rapid. Between 264 BC and 117 AD, Rome grew from a regional Italian power to an empire spanning 3 continents. The Punic Wars, 264–146 BC, brought North Africa and Spain. The eastern Mediterranean fell within a century. Britain, Gaul, and parts of Germany followed. By the early 2nd century AD, Rome governed an estimated 65 million people. But administrative integration lagged far behind military conquest. Newly acquired provinces were initially governed by military commanders with broad, improvised authority. There was no standardized provincial bureaucracy. Instead, Rome relied on a patchwork of local arrangements. In some provinces, existing elites retained power. In others, Roman settlers formed colonial administrations. Tax collection was often contracted to private publicani, tax farmers who paid Rome up front and then extracted what they could from the provinces. This system created inefficiencies and abuses. Tax farmers had little incentive to maintain long-term economic health. Communication between Rome and distant provinces took weeks or months. The road network, often celebrated as a symbol of Roman efficiency, was built gradually over centuries. The Via Appia, connecting Rome to southern Italy, began in 312 BC. Roads into Gaul, Spain, and the East were constructed piecemeal, sometimes generations after initial conquest. Legal integration was similarly slow. Provincial populations lived under a mix of Roman law, local customs, and military decree. Full Roman citizenship was extended gradually and unevenly. Many provinces remained legally distinct from Italy for centuries. The Edict of Caracalla, 212 AD, which granted citizenship to most free inhabitants of the empire, came nearly 4 centuries after Rome's first major overseas conquests. The administrative lag created vulnerabilities. When expansion stalled in the 2nd century AD, the empire's structural weaknesses became visible. The 3rd century crisis, 235–284 AD, saw decades of civil war, economic collapse, and fragmentation. Diocletian's reforms, 284–305 AD, attempted to address these failures by reorganizing the empire into smaller, more manageable provinces, standardizing taxation, and expanding the bureaucracy. But by then, the damage was deep. The crisis demonstrated that Rome's rapid expansion had outpaced its capacity to govern. The Spanish Empire, conquest faster than control, 1492–1650. Spain's conquest of the Americas was astonishingly fast. Hernán Cortés toppled the Aztec Empire between 1519 and 1521. Francisco Pizarro defeated the Inca Empire by 1533. Within half a century, Spain claimed vast territories from Mexico to Chile, but effective governance lagged decades behind. Initially, Spain relied on the encomienda system, a grant of indigenous labor and tribute to Spanish settlers. Encomenderos were supposed to Christianize and protect indigenous populations, but the system functioned more like private extraction with minimal royal oversight. Abuses were widespread. Spain attempted reform. The laws of Burgos, 1512, and the new laws, 1542, sought to limit encomienda exploitation and assert royal authority. Viceroyalties were established in New Spain, 1535, and Peru, 1542, to centralize administration, but enforcement was weak. Communication between Madrid and the Americas took 6 to 12 months. Viceroys governed with significant autonomy. Local elites often ignored or circumvented royal decrees. The Spanish crown did extract wealth. Silver from Potosi and Zacatecas flowed to Europe. But this revenue came through a relatively thin administrative layer. The quinto real, royal fifth tax on precious metals, was easier to collect at mine sites than to enforce across dispersed rural populations. In many regions, indigenous communities retained internal governance structures, and Spanish authority remained nominal. Over time, Spain built more robust institutions, audiencias, high courts, corregidors, regional administrators, and missions. But this process took generations. By the time Spain had developed a functioning imperial bureaucracy, much of the initial momentum of conquest had faded. The empire's administrative depth never fully matched its territorial scale. The Ottoman Empire. Flexible governance, uneven integration, 1299–1700. The Ottoman Empire expanded rapidly from Anatolia into the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa. Constantinople fell in 1453. The Mamluk Sultanate, Egypt and Syria, was conquered in 1517. At its peak in the 16th century, the empire stretched from Hungary to Yemen. The Ottoman administration was pragmatic but uneven. In the core Anatolian and Balkan provinces, the empire imposed direct rule through the timur system, grants of land, revenue to cavalry officers in exchange for military service. This system allowed the empire to maintain a standing army without a centralized tax bureaucracy. But in newly conquered Arab provinces, the Ottomans relied heavily on existing elites. Local governors, tribal leaders, and religious authorities retained significant autonomy. The empire collected tribute and maintained symbolic sovereignty, but deep administrative integration was limited. In distant regions like Yemen and Algeria, Ottoman control was often nominal. This flexibility allowed rapid expansion. The empire did not need to build a full bureaucracy in every province before moving to the next conquest. But it also meant that administrative capacity varied widely. Some regions were tightly governed, others remained loosely affiliated. When the empire's military expansion stalled in the late 17th century, these structural weaknesses became more visible. Provinces with weak central control became harder to tax, defend, and integrate. Across these examples, several structural patterns emerge. First, expansion served as a substitute for internal reform. Conquering new territory generated immediate resources, plunder, tribute, land for distribution that rulers could use to reward elites, fund armies, and finance the state. Building effective institutions required long-term investment with uncertain returns. Expansion was politically easier. Second, the rewards of conquest accrued quickly, the costs accumulated slowly. A successful military campaign could enrich a state within months, but governing new populations required infrastructure, legal systems, communication networks, and cultural integration. These took decades or centuries to develop. The timeline mismatch created an incentive bias toward expansion. Third, territorial growth often postponed institutional development. Empires that expanded rapidly faced constant pressure to manage new conquests. Resources and attention flowed toward the frontier. Internal administrative reform was deferred. This created a feedback loop. More expansion meant less time to consolidate, which made further expansion more attractive as a source of quick gains. Fourth, institutional lag created vulnerability. As long as empires continued expanding, the gap between territorial scale and administrative capacity could be masked. New resources kept flowing in. But when expansion stalled due to military defeat, geographic limits, or resource exhaustion, the structural weaknesses became visible. Poorly integrated provinces became harder to tax and defend. Corruption and local autonomy increased. Empires that had grown large without growing stable faced crisis. Fifth, improvised governance became entrenched. Temporary solutions, tax farming, reliance on local elites, military governors, often persisted long after conquest. These arrangements created vested interests. Reforming them required overcoming powerful groups who benefited from the status quo. Institutional inertia was strong. Sixth, empires reached premature imperial scale. They governed populations and territories far larger than their administrative tools could handle. This was not always a failure of ambition or competence. It was often a rational response to incentives. Expansion delivered immediate benefits. The costs of institutional underdevelopment only became clear later. These patterns were not inevitable. Some empires invested earlier in administrative capacity. And China developed a centralized bureaucracy and civil service exams. The Achaemenid Persians built road networks and provincial governors, satraps, with clearer oversight. But even these empires faced the same fundamental tension. Conquest was fast, governance was slow. The recurring pattern suggests a deeper structural dynamic. Empires expanded before achieving internal stability not because rulers were short-sighted, but because the incentive structure favored it. Territorial growth offered visible, immediate rewards that could be used to secure political support, fund the state, and project power. Institutional development required sustained investment with delayed returns. In competitive international environments, states that prioritized expansion often outpaced those that focused on consolidation, at least in the short term. The long-term consequences, however, were often fragility. Empires that grew large without growing stable faced recurring crises when expansion stalled. The gap between territorial scale and administrative capacity became a source of weakness. This pattern, expansion before stability, reappeared across later periods. The Mongol Empire, 13th-14th centuries, conquered the largest contiguous land empire in history within a few decades. Genghis Khan and his successors relied on tribute systems, local vassals, and military intimidation rather than deep administrative integration. The empire functioned as long as conquest continued. When expansion ended, Fragmentation followed quickly. The Mongol Khanates retained varying degrees of administrative sophistication, but none matched the territorial scale achieved during the initial wave of conquest. The Russian Empire's expansion into Siberia, 16th–19th centuries, followed a similar trajectory. Russian fur traders, Cossack bands, and military expeditions advanced rapidly eastward, reaching the Pacific by the mid-17th century. But effective Russian governance lagged far behind. For centuries, Siberia remained a loosely controlled frontier with limited infrastructure, sparse settlement, and reliance on indigenous tribute. Administrative consolidation took generations. The European scramble for Africa, 1880s–1914, saw rapid territorial claims with minimal initial administrative capacity. European powers drew borders, declared sovereignty, and extracted resources, often with astonishingly small colonial bureaucracies. Effective governance infrastructure, roads, schools, courts, census systems, was built slowly and unevenly. Many colonial borders persisted after independence, but the institutional underdevelopment created long-term challenges for post-colonial states. In each case, the same dynamic repeated. Territorial expansion outpaced the development of governing institutions. The gap created by this lag shaped the trajectory of empires, sometimes for centuries. Modern states are not immune to similar patterns. Rapid economic expansion can outpace regulatory capacity. Corporate growth can exceed managerial structures. The same incentive mismatch, short-term gains from expansion versus long-term costs of institutional development, appears in different contexts. The enduring lesson is structural, not moral. Expansion before stability is not simply a historical curiosity. It reflects a recurring tension between the immediate benefits of growth and the delayed costs of building the systems needed to sustain it. Empires expanded before they achieved internal stability because the incentives favored it. Conquest delivered immediate rewards, plunder, prestige, revenue, elite loyalty. Institution building required sustained investment with uncertain returns. The timeline mismatch created a structural bias toward growth over consolidation. This was not a failure of vision. It was a rational response to the environments rulers faced. States that expanded quickly could project power, secure resources, and reward supporters. Those that focused on internal development risked being overtaken by rivals. In competitive international systems, expansion often came first, but the costs accumulated slowly. Administrative lag created vulnerabilities. When expansion stalled, empires faced the challenge of governing territories their institutions were never designed to manage. Some adapted, others fragmented. The pattern reveals a deeper insight. Territorial scale and institutional depth operate on different timelines. Maps can grow quickly. The machinery of governance cannot. The gap between the two shaped the rise and fall of empires across centuries. Empires expanded before stability took hold not because they lacked the wisdom to build institutions, but because the structure of incentives made conquest faster and more rewarding than the patient work of governance. The map grew before the machine could keep up, and in that gap, the fate of empires was often decided. Different empires tried different solutions to close the gap between expansion and administrative capacity. Some succeeded for a time, others did not. The question of how states balance growth and consolidation remains relevant. If you're interested in exploring how specific empires attempted reform, or how modern states navigate similar tensions, let me know in the comments.